Inner peace isn't usually found in big breakthroughs. It's built quietly in small things we return to each day. The way we sleep, move, act, connect, and care for ourselves often shape our mental and physical health for more than we realize. Today, we are exploring how simple daily habits can gently restore balance and well being. Welcome to Inner Peace Better Health, where we explore how calm, clarity, and self awareness support a healthier life. I am your host Nazish, and today I am joined by Dr. Matthew Campbell, a licensed psychologist with over 20 years of experience supporting mental and emotional health all across ages. He's also the author of Our Primal 5, a practical self care workbook centered on five foundational pillars of well being, sleep, sunlight, movement, social connection, and consumption. In this episode, we are talking about simple daily habits for inner peace and health, and how small, consistent choices can create meaningful changes. So, welcome to the show, Matthew.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. So, Matthew, after years of clinical experience, what helped you realize that simple foundational habits are often where the deepest healing begins?
It has been something that over time and in working with people, I've found that when I'm going through and meeting new clients and we're going over what's happening in their day-to-day lives, that they're obviously coming to my office and experiencing distress, how often it was that the very basic day-to-day habits and routines we're missing. We're missing these things that we as humans were made for. And so I found that a lot of times we were trying to work at things without a good foundation, without taking care of the very basic things that allow peace and healing to occur. And so it led me to focus on this a great deal and find the challenge in taking things that we all know to be important and trying to find ways to help so that we can do that work, which can then lead to peace, happiness, resilience, these types of things to give ourselves such a better chance.
Absolutely, that is so well said and so nicely explained for our listeners. And this grounding perspective really reframes healing as something accessible and not overwhelming or complicated.
I love that. I love your interpretation of that, and I think that that's a very powerful, and on point way of viewing this is that we live in a world where so much of what we struggle with is focusing on things that we don't control. This world, if we let it, can be a very overwhelming place. And so this framework, our Primal 5 framework is really trying to help us to focus on very impactful things on our well-being that are under our control, that over which we can do things to help ourselves.
I absolutely agree. And many people believe inner peace requires major life changes or intense self work. What do we tend to misunderstand about how peace and health are actually built day to day?
Well, I think that often we are looking for some treating ourselves like a puzzle, like if we just figure out this one thing, then that's gonna unravel all the difficulties and it's gonna make, life just all of a sudden easy. And while insight and self-improvement are wonderful, that really begins with taking care of what we were made for. It it begins in a world where that has become more and more difficult, because we have so many choices and we have so many things that can get in the way of this care, compared to our ancestors. It is about pulling back, and recognizing it begins with what the human was made for. The human was made for being outdoors. The human was made for rest. The human was made for movement and being part of a community, being connected, and then putting things in the body that was made for a human. And it's simple. Um, and yet, when we look at the numbers, it's amazing on the downside, that we are not doing this. That the majority of us are not taking care of these needs.
Absolutely. Taking care of needs is something very important, I must agree. And it is reassuring to hear that peace grows from consistency, not perfection or constant self improvement.
Perfection is both not attainable, and um, it's also something that is really harmful when that's our focus, and that goes in a number of different directions. So, if we're seeking something unattainable, then we're bound for frustration. But also, the change and the way that the workbook frames change is that what we're really focused on is improvement. We're trying day by day, week by week to improve. We will not ever be perfect. We will never get to the point where we get, 7 to 9 hours of sleep perfectly every day, that we will spend 30 minutes outdoors in the sunlight every morning, and that we will have the perfect amount of social connect. Like that's not our goal. Our goal is movement towards better health, better peace through these. If we seek to get to the perfect level, we're going to be quite frustrated and we're going to perceive of slips as failures.
Yes, I agree. And when people feel chronically anxious, low, or disconnected, how often do you see disruptions in these basic foundations playing a role?
Well, in my work, if we were to say the five foundations that we focus on, again, that's sunlight, sleep, social connection, movement, exercise, and consumption, mental and physical consumption. When someone comes to my office, I would say when I initially meet with them, it would be unusual if at least two of those weren't at a problematic level. And when we look at like the statistics, at least in our country, in the United States, nearly every one of these areas, it's 50% of people or more are struggling in these areas. The only areas that is not the case for would be alcohol abuse or substance misuse. But otherwise, um, these are really problematic areas for people. And my experience over these years has been that we are not taking care of ourselves, or we're not addressing things in the right way when we are so focused on symptom reduction without making sure that that base, that foundation is strong.
That is so true. And it really highlights how mind and body are in constant conversation, often through habits we overlook.
Undoubtedly. And I think that oftentimes what happens is that because we know these things to be true, it's an interesting thing about us as humans is that we know them to be true, and yet somehow they're minimized. and disregarded. And so it's something where something so basic, I think that one of the problems can be it's not only are we do we tend to be short term focused, but I think that we also get so accustomed to not taking care of these things that the way we feel becomes our normal. And in our defense as humans, I think that we get accustomed to however things are, and so that's normal to us. And so being sleep deprived becomes normal. Being, accustomed to being dehydrated, becoming accustomed to being isolated. Uh, these things become normal, and we don't really recognize until we address them just what an impact they'll have on us.
I agree. Uh, so, when someone starts tending to these simple habits, what changes do you notice in their mood, resilience, or sense of inner calm?
It's really That's one of the most enjoyable things for me is to work with someone, and oftentimes it can be one of these, and perhaps sometimes it's the one that's in the greatest deficit that they're struggling with the most. But it's really rewarding to work with someone, and they are so focused upon certain aspects of their life or pain or certain emotional experiences, and when they shore up one of these to see how significantly it can affect them. Like, two examples that I think um, come to mind most quickly is someone who's isolated, and maybe I think of situations where something has happened in their lives, and they naturally focus on the pain that comes from loss and such, and that is such a painful human experience. And I can think of a few instances in particular where once that person found connection, once they found a bond and felt care from others, just how impactful that was. Or another example is movement, is when, we know that movement and exercise can be as powerful of an antidepressant as a medication. These are things that are available to us. Now we need, it's good that we live in, a time where things can be treated, and we have medications and things to be helpful. I also think it's wonderful for us to realize what we can also do for ourselves. So, these are things that, when we address them and can experience the benefits, as you mentioned, yes, another one I didn't mention, of course, is sleep. Is people feeling a calm and being more able to handle emotions, with a more rested mind and body.
That is so true, and that is so well said. I must agree. Those subtle shifts, more steadiness, more energy, can quickly transform how someone experiences their day.
Yes, it is, handling the day is made much easier for sure. And, I think that, for example, with your podcast, and I think the idea of peace, well, and I was listening to, a recent podcast you had, and it was on, I think one was on boundaries, one was on forgiveness. And the beauty of those approaches is we're letting things be as they are. We're accepting what we control, what we don't control, and living within that. And in a manner, what I'm talking about is very similar. That we're recognizing what is the truth. Well, the truth of living in this world is that we as humans were made to do certain things. And logically, when we don't live in concert with that, when we don't respect that, we will struggle more. And so let's address that.
I, I absolutely agree. And for someone listening who already feels stretched thin, What is the compassionate way to begin integrating these habits without adding more pressure?
I think that I think that the place I begin, I'm a believer that when we are working towards change, we need to begin with two things. The first is understanding and acceptance. And then the second is action. I think that it's important sometimes when we talk about these foundational aspects of functioning, it's easy to say, well, I should do that, or I know that, or things like that, and be critical. I think that's a mistake for a few reasons, but most of all, these things have become more difficult for us. We as humans, we often are very short term focused. We focus on the things, or we do the things we're familiar with. And we live in a world where there are, through technology, through our food manufacturing, through, all of the different things, we can stay inside all the time, in these comfortable locations often, and these types of things. And so, compared to our ancestors, we have to make many more intentional choices, whereas for our ancestors, they didn't really have many choices in these regards. So for us, it does require more intention. And then I think the second thing is trying to take stock of where we are in these five areas. And trying to, once we identify, we don't want to try to do everything at once. In fact, the workbook emphasizes that through taking a weekly approach for each area. You can't work on everything. At one time, we're trying to focus on one thing at a time. And so, we frame it that way. We try to find perhaps this is an area where either I need the most improvement or I think I can start getting momentum going by addressing this. And then we take reasonable steps. We're not trying to get to the end when we start. We're not trying to get to the finish line. We're trying to create improvement. And so if I am not getting outside much, let's try to spend 5 to 10 minutes outside and trying to get that sunlight. Or if I'm very isolated, let me try to, 1 or 2 times a day, reach out in some form or fashion. Could be a text message or, something else, but trying to increase it. And so that's what I would recommend is I understand this is not as easy as it sounds. And then I'm going to take steps in that direction and build upon those.
Absolutely. And it does sound very, very well put. That emphasis on starting small, so aligned with sustainable healing. Life
And
hap- yeah.
And I think that what you're saying there is that yes, that progressive way and accepting that this is, life. We are working throughout our life. We are moving and it is to be alive is to try to be finding a movement, a direction, and the idea that we can do something and that's going to fix it all. That doesn't put us in a very positive position.
Yeah, I agree. And life happens, routines get disrupted, motivation dips. What helps people return to these habits with kindness rather than self criticism?
I think that just as we would want others to do for us, we want to look at ourselves in terms of um, recognizing obstacles, recognizing difficulties, recognizing that we are human. We are not perfect, um, and the best that we can do is to be giving our effort to be trying to make movement in these regards. It is not failure to have slips, as you said. It's not failure to have life happen, and things to get in our way. The only failure that's possible is that we stop trying. That's the only way that failure is a possibility, is that as long as we keep moving, as long as we realize that, you know, part of the change process is failure. I'm contradicting myself there, but part of is slips, is plateaus. These are things that are part of the change process. It strengthens improvement when we have a slip and then we get back and start moving in the desired no, excuse me, I'm sorry, the desired direction. That's part of our process of change. It strengthens it. It's something change is not an unending upward climb. It's going to involve dips. It's going to involve plateaus. And so long as we're trying to keep that movement going, we're being intentional, then that's success.
Yeah, I agree. And that flexibility, seeing habits as supportive rather than rigid, seems a key to a long term peace.
It is. It is that compassion, the understanding. And sometimes the word compassion, people can have a reaction to that, almost like that is something that is deserved. And I don't like to get into that a whole lot. I think that that's a slippery slope when working with people. But I do think that just being honest that, we are human. We are not perfect. And what it's what I am encouraging here is a very real world thing. We all struggle with these things. We all are going to have difficulties. Shame and guilt; those are really poisonous fuels for our behavior. Those are not going to have great outcomes when those are what we're trying to do, criticism and shaming ourselves to do things rather than I'm much more likely to have a positive outcome when I understand what's going on. I recognize I accept the difficulty and then I try to move forward and I create a plan and I set a short-term goal. I think that breaking we're talking about things that are long-term focused, what's healthiest in the long term. And sometimes what can help us get on that track is, okay, this is going to be my goal this week. I'm going to reach out, 3 times this week to people. As I said earlier, I'm going to spend this amount of time outdoors. I'm going to do these, have these short-term goals to try to create some momentum.
Absolutely, I agree. So, listeners, this one is for you. If inner peace were built on small choice at a time, which habit might your mind or body be quietly asking for right now? Lasting inner peace and health grow from simple, repeated acts of care that bring the mind and body back into the balance. Matthew, for our listeners who would like to learn more about your work, our Primal Five, or your work, where can they find you?
The book, our Primal Five, the workbook, it's available on Amazon. We also have a website where uh, that there's a link to the book on Amazon, and there's also a newsletter. If you look through the website, there's a newsletter that you can subscribe to, and it'll keep going over these concepts the goal is to keep it on the forefront of our minds to create more intention in taking care of these foundational and very impactful aspects of our life.
Absolutely. I would make sure to include all these details into the show notes so that many people can join you and learn more about your work. And thank you so much for being with us on Inner Peace, Better Health. It was an amazing conversation with you. And listeners, if today's conversation resonated, I invite you to slow down and notice the small habits that support your well being, one gentle step at a time. Until next time, may you care for yourself with simplicity, patience, and compassion.